Welcome to Verified RX, your prescription for success. Brought to you by the Vizient Center for Pharmacy Practice Excellence.
New data from the summer Vizient Spend Management Outlook show that in the inpatient space, high-cost drugs, especially CAR T treatments like Yescarta and Breyanzi, are major drivers of drug spend. To help offset these costs, some of these medications may qualify for additional reimbursement through the New Technology Add-on Payment, or NTAP, a program that supports innovations that substantially improve care for Medicare beneficiaries. My colleague, Carolyn Liptak, Pharmacy Executive Director at the Center for Pharmacy Practice Excellence at Vizient, joins me today to cover the purpose of this add-on payment, the criteria necessary for drugs to qualify, and how to maximize this benefit. I'm Stacy Lauderdale, Associate Vice President of Evidence-Based Medicine and Drug Information at Vizient, and your program host. Carolyn, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Stacy. I'm happy to be here.
Carolyn, right now there is a lot of buzz out there about reimbursement in the outpatient space, from the 340B rebate model pilot to NTAP. But today we're going to be a little bit different here on the Verified RX podcast, and we're going to focus on the inpatient space. Vizient hosted a wonderful reimbursement webinar last week that touches on the outpatient space. So if you're a Vizient Pharmacy Program participant and would like to listen to that recording, I'll go ahead and make sure that we drop it in the show notes to access the recording. But today, we're going to discuss inpatient reimbursement, specifically the New Technology Add-on Payment, or NTAP for short. What is NTAP, and why did CMS create this program?
NTAP stands for New Technology Add-on Payment. The new technologies that it includes are really drugs and devices, and it only applies to the inpatient setting. So if we back up a little bit and look at when Medicare was established in 1965, it was originally a retrospective cost-based reimbursement. And then from about 1967 to 1983, CMS costs rose from $3 billion to $37 billion annually. And specifically from 1970 to 1980, there was an 88% increase in cost on the inpatient side. If you look at that model, it included an incentive to provide more services. The more services you provided, the more you got paid. There was a lot of new costly medical technology. So to control costs, the prospective payment model was introduced. This is a per-case reimbursement, and it's based on a relatively homogeneous category for each hospital admission. These are called diagnosis-related groups, or DRGs. So Medicare now pays hospitals a flat rate per case for inpatient care. Efficient hospitals are rewarded, and inefficient hospitals have an incentive to become more efficient. Now, this DRG payment rate is based on the average cost of care for each of these diagnosis-related groups in the previous 2 years. But if you think about it, this calculation can't incorporate payments for newly available expensive drugs or devices because the DRG was based on previous cost. That's where CMS created NTAP, or this New Technology Add-on Payment. And it's an additional payment. It's still bundled into the single payment. It's not separate. It's bundled, but it's intended as a bridge payment for the 2 to 3 years it takes for a DRG to recalibrate.
Let's make sure that I am understanding this concept correctly. Let's say there's a new drug and it does have a NTAP, but the majority of health systems, for whatever reasons, decide not to adopt the technology, but a few do. If I understand correctly, those early adopters, once the NTAP expires, may be financially at risk because if we don't have a large majority adopting, that DRG doesn't recalibrate.
Absolutely, because theoretically, it takes 2 to 3 years for the DRG to recalibrate. But you're right. If a drug has a lot of early adopters, that DRG is going to recalibrate sooner than if the drug does not have a lot of early adopters, because there won't be a lot of health systems putting that expense in the cost report. So the DRG can take more than 2 or 3 years. And we do sometimes see when new drugs come off of the NTAP list that the DRG payment doesn't match the NTAP payment. It's less.
Thank you for clarifying that. And I've heard people use that argument before when you say, well, it has an NTAP, and they say, well, I don't want to encourage utilization if the DRG isn't going to recalibrate.
Yeah, that makes sense. But if you choose to use the drug, you do have to use that drug. At least there is an NTAP for those first couple of years.
And that's a great point. You said that new technologies are eligible, such as new drugs and new devices. But obviously, every year there is a limited list of drugs and devices that are selected for NTAP. Can you tell me how medications qualify for NTAP status?
It starts with an application by the manufacturer. The manufacturer has to apply for NTAP status. It's not something that's granted automatically. They have to apply about a year in advance. For example, this October 6th of 2025 is the deadline for manufacturers to apply for medications for fiscal year 2027. And the reason for that is manufacturers apply in October, there's town halls in November or December, and then we don't see approval of these drugs until the following August. Once it's approved in August, is just in time for the new fiscal year, because in the inpatient prospective payment system, the fiscal year begins on October 1st. This October 1st is the beginning of the 2026 fiscal year. Once the manufacturers apply, there's 3 things that must be present. First, the drug has to represent a substantial clinical improvement. The second is that the drug must be new and not substantially similar to an existing medication. And then the third is that the drug must be relatively costly, such that the DRG payment rate would be inadequate. On top of that, infectious disease agents have been somewhat disadvantaged in acquiring NTAP status, mostly because it's hard to prove substantial clinical improvement right at the launch, since clinical adoption and comparative evidence take time. So CMS created a separate pathway called the Qualified Infectious Disease Pathway. And this makes it easier for new antibiotics to qualify, and it's also an incentive for manufacturers to bring novel antibiotics to market. And the advantage of this pathway is that the drug does not have to show substantial clinical improvement, and it does not have to be new. It just has to be relatively costly. And the FDA has to designate a medication for this pathway at the time of approval.
It's interesting. The QID product, I understand why we definitely want there to be innovation in the antibiotic space. You said it doesn't have to show substantial clinical improvement. And again, I understand why. But you did say for non-antibiotic treatments, they have to represent a substantial clinical improvement. And as an evidence-based medicine drug information pharmacist, I'm curious who makes that decision of a substantial clinical improvement. Is this a discussion point at these town hall meetings that you mentioned?
It is. And specifically, what is meant by a substantial clinical improvement is that the medication has to offer a treatment option for a patient population that is unresponsive to or ineligible for currently available treatments. Or it has to offer the ability to diagnose a medical condition in a patient population where that condition is currently undetectable, or it has to offer the ability to diagnose a medical condition earlier in a patient population than allowed by current available methods, or it has to significantly improve clinical outcomes relative to medications previously available.
All right. So I do see there's 3 different categories for qualifications. So that is helpful. All right. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the cost of some of these medications and the value that NTAP provides. I was scrolling through some of the medications that are on the fiscal year 2025 list for NTAP payments. And what I found was that there are several cell and gene therapies, including both gene therapies that are approved for sickle cell disease. Both of those gene therapies have WAC prices in the range of $2 to $3 million. What value does NTAP provide to use these costly new gene therapies?
There's 2 formulas, and it's one of these 2 formulas, whichever is less. The majority of NTAP medications, the new technology add-on payment maximum payment rate is set at 65% of the estimated cost of the new medication if the estimated cost for the case, including the new technology, exceeds Medicare's payment. Or it's 65% of the difference between the full DRG payment and the estimated cost for the case. And it's whichever is less. And that payment rate goes up to 75% for qualified infectious disease products. Also, starting in October of 2024, CMS finalized a policy so that gene therapies treating sickle cell disease that have NTAP status also receive an NTAP payment of 75%. And these NTAP payments typically continue for 2 to 3 years, enough time for the DRG to recalibrate.
Yeah, and certainly will be necessary for many of these newer, more expensive gene therapies that are coming to market. In preparing for this podcast, I went searching for the NTAP list, as I knew one must exist. But I will be honest with you, I found it very difficult to locate this list. So can you share with our listeners how to find the list of products that are eligible for NTAP?
It's not where you think it might be because CMS does have an NTAP webpage, but that's not where the list resides. The list comes out once a year. It goes into effect on October 1st, which is the beginning of the Inpatient Prospective Payment System's fiscal year. But the list resides on the Inpatient Prospective Payment System's 2026 Final Rule homepage. So you have to go to the final rule homepage, not the NTAP page. And when you go out to the final rule homepage, there's a MAC implementation file. It seems to always be number 8. And that's where you'll find the fiscal year 2026 new technology add-on payment file. The file includes an Excel spreadsheet that has 3 tabs. The first tab is what's new for this fiscal year. The second tab are those drugs that are continuing from previous approval. And then the last tab includes those that are coming off of NTAP payment, those that are going to be discontinued.
So that is very helpful because I went to the NTAP page and then struggled to locate it from there. So thank you so much. It sounds like since the fiscal year of 2026 starts October 1st, that list is already published. Our listeners could go out and determine which new drugs and devices will be covered under NTAP payment for fiscal year 2026.
Yes, that list is already posted.
All right. One of the things that I hear in terms of feedback when the NTAP program is discussed is some pharmacists will say it's not compelling, even if an NTAP payment exists, because it's very difficult to ensure reimbursement. So I'm curious if you have any best practices to share with our listeners to ensure that NTAP payment is captured once the drug is used.
Reimbursement is actually very straightforward. When you go out and look for the NTAP list, what's going to be included in the NTAP list is the maximum add-on payment that you could receive, and also the very precise ICD-10 codes that need to be used. Within the coding section, some of these medications require there's just a single code that has to be used, and others will require a single code to represent use of the drug, but may need some additional codes for additional information. For example, sometimes we'll see drugs approved through the QIDP pathway, but they're only approved for a specific indication, so not all uses, or they'll only be included for a specific organism, and that coding information has to be included. For example, for Breyanzi, the coding specifically requires that you indicate if the induction of the therapy was into a peripheral vein or a central vein. It will also require some additional coding that says specifically the site of the small cell B-cell lymphoma. And so that NTAP list tells you exactly how to code. Where it gets complicated is the ICD-10 code has to specifically go into section X of the claim, and it must be coded by the coder. So CMS does not pick up the use of this medication by the NDC and add the NTAP payment automatically. If the coder misses the opportunity to code for the NTAP payment, you will not get reimbursed. There are some things that hospital pharmacies can do to make a concerted effort to try to ensure they're getting NTAP payments. First is to just be aware that the new MAC implementation file is going to come out every October 1st. You can start looking for it in August and September and review the list, see if anything on the list is on your formulary. But you also want to refer to this list throughout the year as you add new drugs to your formulary. Your revenue cycle team is probably looking for this list in October and can begin to code appropriately. But if you add a new drug 6 months into that year, they may not be aware that you're doing that. So that check every time you add a new drug to the formulary is important. Another important tool is to upload warning logic in your EHR that reminds the coders that whenever that drug is administered, it forces the coder to stop and add this precise coding. Then there's a couple of other things that can be done. You can do a pre-bill audit. Some health systems will review utilization. This list isn't very long. There's not a lot of drugs on these lists, and you're probably not dispensing them on any regular day-to-day basis. So utilization is probably pretty small. So you can run a utilization report on a regular weekly basis, for example, and then ensure that the coding is present before that claim is submitted. Go behind the coders and make sure that's been done. And then you can conduct a post-bill audit by using the CMS Web Pricer. This will estimate reimbursement for you. And on the Web Pricer, there is a field to enter the NTAP code, and then you can compare reimbursement to what was actually received. You can do a post-bill audit and then try to bill for the corrected amount. It is straightforward, but your rev cycle team has to be aware and your coders have to be on the lookout for when these drugs are used.
So you've got to get your revenue cycle team involved if you're going to add one of these agents to formulary.
Absolutely. There has to be that collaboration. There was some talk a couple of years ago about possibly making NTAP payments more automatic. We haven't heard any of that conversation turn into anything new or different. So the gold standard is to make your coders aware and audit before or after, particularly on some of these NTAP payments that are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for sharing those best practices with our listeners. If our listeners want more information, where should they go?
To just understand more about NTAP and how it works, the same webpage that you went to when you were looking for the list. But there is a CMS New Medical Services and New Technologies webpage that explains the whole process of how NTAP works, how the manufacturers can apply, and just a lot of great information about the program. And then most importantly, you have to go to the CMS fiscal year 2026 IPPS final rule homepage, not to be confused with the proposed rule homepage because it won't be there. It'll only be on the final rule homepage. And then you've got to scroll down to the MAC implementation file that's labeled for fiscal year 2026 new technology add-on payment. And I'll drop links to all three of these in the show notes. And I'll also drop the link to the CMS Web Pricer for those post-bill audits.
That's great. Yes. So we'll have all of this information and links to this information in the show notes. So Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us to share your thoughts and insights on the NTAP program. It's really been great chatting with you today.
Thanks, Stacy. It's been great chatting with you as well. Join us for more Verified RX podcasts. Subscribe today. Like us. Send us your comments. We'd love to hear from you. Verified RX is a prescription for success and is brought to you by the Vizient Center for Pharmacy Practice Excellence. Thanks for listening.